So welcome everybody to this event. Thank you so much for being here. I know this is a busy time of the semester. Very happy to have such a great crowd here today. And we are honored to be joined by two colleagues who are doing really, really exciting work at the intersection of wild animal welfare and environmental conservation, who are going to be having a conversation with us today. So I will introduce our speakers and format in a moment, but first I can introduce myself and my colleague, Becca. My name is Jeff Sebo, and along with Becca Franks here with us today, we direct the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program. This program is hosting this event. The Wild Animal Welfare Program is a research and outreach and field building program that examines what wild animals are like and how humans and wild animals interact and how we can improve our interactions with wild animals at scale through research in the humanities, the social sciences, the natural sciences, through events and other activities. So if you have any interest in those topics and events like this one, please do go to our website and sign up for the events list. I will also mention that the Wild Animal Welfare Program is part of the Department of Environmental Studies that asks these types of questions about animals and the environment more generally. And we have an undergraduate program and an MA program in animal studies, and now a PhD program in environmental studies launching next year, which will be inclusive of animal studies as well. So if you have interest in studying any of these topics as an undergraduate, as a MA student, as a PhD student, please do go to the environmental studies website, and you can follow links there for all of those curricular programs, as well as for other research programs and centers that are hosted in the department. Okay, now with that out of the way, let me tell you about our event today. Again, we are thrilled to be hosting this conversation about recognizing animal agency in environmental conservation. And that will be a conversation that we have with Marc Bekoff and Matthew Hayek, who have done a variety of really interesting and important work in this space, and recently authored papers that we thought would be great to put into conversation with each other. So let me tell you a little bit about each speaker, and then I can tell you about the format for the event, and then we can ask the speakers to summarize their recent work. So first of all, a professor emeritus of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Colorado Boulder, Marc Bekoff has published 31 books, or 41, depending on how you count, multi-volume encyclopedias. And he has won many awards for his research on animal behavior, animal emotions, cognitive ethology, compassionate conservation, and animal protection, and has worked closely with Jane Goodall as co-chair of the ethics committee of the Jane Goodall Institute, and is a former Guggenheim Fellow. He works closely with inmates at the Boulder County Jail as well. And on a personal note, I'll say that his research has been really influential for me and others in the program. So it really is an honor to have him here. And then secondly, Matthew Hayek is an environmental scientist and assistant professor in our very own NYU Department of Environmental Studies. His research quantifies the environmental impacts of our food system, with a specific focus on farmed animals, their greenhouse gas emissions, such as methane, and land use changes, including deforestation. His work has also interrogated how these environmental impacts intersect with farmed animal welfare, wildlife habitat, zoonotic diseases, and how policies can address those intersecting risks. So we are honored to have both of these speakers here today. We'll start by asking them to give brief overviews of their recent papers on this topic, and we'll then ask them some questions to get the conversation started. And about halfway through the event, maybe a little bit more, we'll also open it up to questions from the audience. So as always, you can use the Q&A tab on Zoom to enter your questions and comments in writing and reply and upvote others. And then Becca, when the time comes, is going to present a curated list of audience questions and comments to the speakers. So feel free to go ahead and get those questions and comments in the Q&A tab, not the chat, the Q&A tab, whenever you like, and we can keep track of them. So without further ado, thanks again to everybody for being here. And I'm going to ask Marc, first of all, to tell us a little bit about your recent work on this topic.
Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thanks for doing this event. I'm going to read some notes here because my handwriting is terrible. So the paper that we wrote and appeared a couple of months ago is called Wildlife Conservation: The Importance of Individual Personality Traits and Sentience. I'm a field biologist, and I've done long-term field work on wild coyotes. I've done some work on wolves, penguins in Antarctica, birds in the foothills of Colorado, which is what I'm looking at now. And that's actually my view, Dale. So come back to Colorado sometimes, Dale. Um, just because the people have written a lot about individual personalities in field work, but the applied aspects have been not totally ignored, but relatively ignored. So what I tried to do, and I'm just going to take a few minutes, I was looking for some common elements across different disciplines. So one of my foci, I guess, is the importance of individuals. So when you're studying personalities, you're focusing on individual differences in whatever traits they are. The paper deals a lot with shyness and boldness because they're pretty simple to study, actually. And the other matter of individuals would be it's one of the major tenets of compassionate conservation that the life of every individual matters. Because they have intrinsic or inherent value, regardless of their instrumental value. And I'm not a philosopher, but I think I know what those mean. And then in a book that Jessica Pierce and I wrote called The Animal's Agenda, we actually wrote about and really developed a field of the science of animal well-being to replace the science of animal welfare, because animal welfare doesn't really protect many animals at all. And the basis for animal well-being was that the life of once again, the life of every individual matters. So that's been one of my foci for a really long time. Personality is often defined as individual differences in behavior that are consistent across contexts and time. Excuse me. And an idea that came to me this morning, but I've been working on it a little, is I'm not sure how consistent they really are. Because as a field biologist, I've seen changes in personality in wild animals depending on social context and habitat, food availability, other competitors who might be around other predators, or distribution of prey species. So one thing I'm just going to throw out now is that I think part of the definition of personality could allow for that kind of flexibility because it would be adaptive for individuals to change, if you will, their boldness or shyness or whatever personality traits we're talking about as social and ecological conditions change. So for example, when I studied wild coyotes, when they come out of the den at 3 weeks of age, they've been in the same hole in the ground. They have the same mother and father, basically the same microenvironment. You already see pretty stark differences among them in terms of shyness, boldness. We call it neophilia or neophobia, whether they're afraid of novel events. Frankly, some of the young coyotes were just so obnoxious. I wish them well, but I hoped we wouldn't see them again. And in my field work in Antarctica, there are distinct personality differences among the penguins. And when you spend enough time studying them, they don't all look alike. Although, when you glance at them, they do. So that's one thing that maybe we'll get into, is just sort of the flexibility as an adaptive trait in individual personality. And the compassionate conservation thing has been really central to my work over a good number of years. And Dale and I, back in the 90s, wrote papers that were really the foundation. Once again, we called them, they dealt with reflective ethology and the application of different ethological principles, and also the importance of individuals. And maybe when we get into the discussion on the ground here right now, there's some new wolves, very few actually, because Colorado Parks and Wildlife demolished the project, and we will get into that. But I was at the release of the first group of wolves, and I can't say much about them because I'm not allowed to, but they were distinct personality differences among the first 5 wolves. And I have some evidence that that might have mattered in their adaptability to their new home in Colorado, because they were kidnapped in Oregon and dropped here and are trying to live. But we'll get into that later. So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to
Okay,
this.
great. Thanks so much, Mark. Matthew, would you like to give a brief overview of your recent paper on this topic?
Sure thing. Although I don't think I can quite match Mark in terms of his brevity, but I'll try to be as succinct as possible. Our somewhat recent paper on this was called Animal Agency in Wildlife Conservation and Management, published in Conservation Biology. And I had the pleasure of collaborating with two wonderful colleagues, Emily Edelblut at Boston, then at Boston University, finishing up as a graduate student, and Rupa Krithivasan, who is finishing up at Clark as a graduate student. And we all kind of got together and we're looking at a number. I was collaborating with two animal geographers, and we were looking at a number of just in general ecosystem conservation strategies, and all kind of collectively griped about a number of conservation strategies treating animals like pretty mechanistically and pretty predictably, and noticing just anecdotally at first how many times that failed. One of my collaborators, Emily, had a pretty strong set of anecdotes that she had turned into a PhD research project about how much urban leopards loved this large wildlife reserve that's essentially like a large urban park, think like Forest Hills in Portland, Oregon, where the concentration of leopards was actually much greater than any scientist even thought possible, and that had ever been observed out in the wild. And these leopards were incredibly well habituated to human settlements, but of course, being leopards, there were also a number of conflicts with nearby households around the urban periphery. So we decided that we wanted to kind of formalize our search. And while I didn't necessarily have a past in wildlife conservation, I devoted a lot of my PhD research to the conservation of intact terrestrial ecosystems like old growth forests, both in the Amazon and in New England and Massachusetts. So it's something that I cared about, and then had the experience of being at the Harvard Animal Law and Policy program, in particular looking at the welfare of farmed animals. But we realized that the sentience, intelligence, and autonomy and agency of wild animals was not really being taken into account, and that there were a number of examples in the literature where conservation programs seemed to fail on their own terms because they had not really accounted for animals as being, frankly, intelligent, unpredictable, and robust as individuals and groups of intelligent creatures. So we found in particular three limiting assumptions across 190 publications that seem to cause a number of these wildlife conservation management strategies to fail. Those assumptions are that animal behaviors are rigid and homogeneous, that is like very predictable. Another limiting assumption was that animals prefer pristine or wild habitats preferentially to human settlements because they're, wild. And Marc's paper and a number of papers show that that is not always or often isn't the case, that they'll actually try really hard to get back to some areas of human settlements where they're well habituated, can find food sources, sociality with one another. And then lastly, that human wildlife relationships are somehow of marginal or secondary importance than, to animals just having a pristine and intact environment, when really human animal relationships can often be make or break with respect to the success or failure of a conservation program. So some of these limitations really went back to the definition of wildlife conservation and management, which is, put kind of coarsely, the practice and study of conserving wild animal populations and or managing their interactions with humans, resources, and built environments. And already we see some limitations in that definition, right? Because there's a focus on population animals, for one, rather than a host of other concerns and interests to those animals. It's a very anthropocentric definition, and it defines animals in their interactions with humans in an antagonistic posture. That is, you're either looking out for humans or you're looking out for whole populations of animals. There's also no mention of animal sociality, animal welfare, or animal autonomy. And so, we decided to look at these interests and especially kind of come up with examples of animal behaviors that violated these assumptions, including African elephants teaching each other to break fences and adapt to deterrence, including electrified fences and noise generators around villagers' croplands because they wanted repeat access to those croplands and taught each other how to inventively break those fences. There was also the examples of wolves in Canada being relocated to the wild when they came in conflict with livestock herds, but then trying to get back to those human areas, they actually traveled through farmland and likely killed more domesticated animals than they would have if they had been originally left in those locations. And lastly, deer hunting approval in Florida seems to have heightened the alertness of deer in a way that hurt the ability of Florida panthers to prey on them. So, we're not necessarily saying here that the opposite of these assumptions is always preferable, that the opposite of animals always prefer wild habitats should instead be that active human stewardship or companionship is always preferable for wild animals. Obviously, it's not. But rather that the attention to animals' own preferences and their subjectivity or their interactivity that they construct with human communities is really essential information for planning successful wildlife conservation and management programs. And there's a number of ways that we describe that traditional conservationists and human wildlife management or conflict managers could potentially, improve or reconsider their deterministic conservation programs. But overall, we really just thought it was important to include 5 major assumptions that are part and parcel of this concept that we're replacing with, the kind of limiting assumptions that's called animal agency. And the 5 pillars of that are that animals can adapt to adjust to their environments, that they make active decisions in their environments, and those decisions can change from population of animal to even individual animals, as a lot of Marc's research, including his most recent paper, attested, that animals have individuality and sociality. They have learned culture and connections and kinship with one another, that they're sentient, that is, they feel, and there's, potentially some self-awareness of those feelings, and that drives them to make different decisions. And that lastly, they co-shape environments actively with the humans with whom they share those environments. And as one example of animal agency and action, we're not necessarily saying that you have to or providing a prescription, but even sometimes noticing that conservation programs unconsciously or randomly, that these connections kind of emerged from deterministic plans going awry. For example, in Colorado, there was a rigid 2 strikes rule for deterring bear conflicts or encroachment into people's property. However, program managers often bent those rather strict rules based on their knowledge of individual bears, such as, bears sometimes like getting closer and can give people a scare, but are very unlikely to attack or go into a waste or food bin. And so their bending of the rules was an instance of incorporating animal individuality into otherwise a deterministic set of relocation and euthanasia that actually seemed to help the success of that program. And of course, lastly, that it's not just the program's definition of success that matters, but actually we can use animal agency to expand the definition of success to include things like not just preserving animal populations and preventing conflicts, but preserving animal cultures, languages, and societies, conserving learned behaviors of animals. 2 different pods of orcas or dolphin have completely different hunting and play behavior in 2 different areas. Ecological interactions, as well as animal welfare, autonomy, and their self-determination of their interests. So with that, I'll leave it there. Happy to talk about more examples, but I think it's time for a conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, both Mark and Matthew, for those introductions. And as I said before, we are now just going to get the ball rolling with the conversation. I can ask Mark and Matthew some questions to invite them to flesh out their ideas a little bit. And in the meantime, everybody, please do be adding your own questions and comments in the Q&A tab. And I can start with a question that we proposed to you beforehand, and then I reserve the right to ask, unexpected follow-up questions depending on where the conversation goes. But we can see. So your work and your summaries focus on particular what seem like overlapping concepts like individuality, personality, agency, and these all broadly gesture at the idea that individual members of different species can be different, have different traits, beliefs, desires, preferences, and goals, and so on. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more, each of you, about what you mean when you talk about personality and agency and individuality, and maybe invite you to put your areas of focus in to conversation with each other and see, are you talking about the same set of issues or different but overlapping set of issues? So that is the first question, and maybe I'll kick it to Mark first.
I mean, yeah. Well, when you look at packs of coyotes and wolves, for example, and probably groups of other animals, you see a spectrum of personalities, if you will. You're not going to get a pack of coyotes of 6, if you will, alpha males or wolves. So somehow the differences, and I think if I'm not answering your question, let me know. I mean, but somehow those
No, go for it.
those personality differences are very important to the formation and maintenance of a cohesive group, where individuals can express themselves, and then they can work for individual desires and goals, if you will, and also collectively as members of a group. So we had the opportunity of watching wild coyote packs form, and I know Rick McIntyre and others in Yellowstone have also had that opportunity. And a lot of it is, I should say, some is predictable as to which individuals would occupy which role, if you will, and or which personality type would occupy different roles. But there's not really a lot of data on this. I mean, it's just pretty simple. We report on some work on black bears. We're in different habitats. They're more inquisitive, more exploratory, and in others, they're not. So the reason I'm excited about all this research on personalities and sentience, or agency, let's just say agency, is because I think it's going to be on the menu for future research. People will be looking at these sorts of variables when they've largely ignored them. I mean, I can go through old literature on carnivores and you'll see talking about or around these issues. But one of the things, like in my work, and we really, maybe it was because of my mentor and just my interest years ago, was looking at individual differences, and also a real concern for individual well-being. Okay.
Great,
Well-being,
thank you.
yeah.
Matthew?
Yeah, I would say, what the domain in which our two papers look is a little bit different. I mean, ours, for instance, was a literature review. It was way less of a case study. So we're really kind of trying to think about how this concept of animal agency affects hundreds of outcomes. And, personality and individuality are such huge parts of that. I mean, ultimately, I think a really foundational principle with animal agency is that animals are co-shaping these outcomes, right? They're not just victims or recipients of human behavior, that they have their own needs and wants and desires, and they're going to act in ways that fulfill that. Interestingly, I don't think that concepts of like individuality, personality, intelligence are totally necessary for animal agency, but animal agency is, it is intelligence and individuality are sufficient for it, right? That something is going on with animals, and more in likelihood because of what we know from etiology and a lot of Marc's papers, is that there's multiple things going on with animals. They're at least, you know, mammals and a lot of large animals have very multifaceted personalities, which was something that was they were taken for granted as not having several decades ago. But it's all coming together in a way that they're acting out of their self-interest, and this is actually affecting conservation outcomes. So I think what we're driving at is something's going on. And even if, as conservation managers out there don't necessarily want to believe that we should project all the human emotions onto animals, and again, Marc's work has gone and show how like we shouldn't be so worried about um, anthropomorphism, right? We can safely project human traits onto animals as long as we do so critically and skeptically. But even if you're kind of a more traditional conservation manager, it's that there's just all this evidence pointing to that, if you're not accounting for the fact that animals, even the same species of animal, are going to act out of their self-interest in largely different ways, then you might be setting up a more rigid conservation program for failure.
Mm-hmm.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, please do, Marc. Thanks.
Yeah, so those are really important points, Matthew. So in our coyote work, we learned, because it was an 8.5-year study, we had thousands of hours of observation, that coyotes living as few as 1 kilometer away had distinctly different social organizations depending on the availability of winter food. And that's been well documented across a wide diversity of species. So there's no the coyote, there's no the elephant. When I was in Africa, I saw elephants living in all different sorts of social groups, or patterns of social organization. So I think that's really important, because on the ground, when you're starting to interfere in the lives of these animals, and you all know I'm pretty much of a hands-off person that way, you really can't say, well, this is how we're going to treat coyotes, and it's not too long ago that a whole variety of different non-human animals were treated as machines, as if they didn't have feelings and beliefs and desires and goals and individual personalities. And so, that's one among other reasons why so many conservation protocols failed, because the people doing the conservation work really didn't know the behavior of the animals they were micromanaging. And I love the phrase co-shaping their lives, because where humans and non-humans cross paths, which is almost everywhere, really, there is this co-shaping going on. And up until recently, maybe with the birth and the growth of compassionate conservation, most wildlife managers, no matter what they say, and I've worked with a lot of them, they just give lip service to sentience and agency and personalities, and I'll jump into it now and just say, because one of the things I will get to later is that for me, killing is off the table and harming animals is off the table. It just really hasn't worked. And I'll leave it at that. But this co-shaping I love that phrase, Matthew. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to elaborate on, which is you're driving to something that was originally at the fringe of our paper, but we found it incredibly hard to ignore, which is that animal agency and conservation is a two-way street. That acknowledging animal agency can help the conservation's own definition of success come out better, which is generally improving numbers and reducing conflict for a whole species of animals. But if you pay attention to animal agency, you actually realize that multiple things are worth conserving. And one big thing is learned behavior and cultures, right? Just like you mentioned, to like we look at the species as the level of conservation, but the same species of animal in different packs, groups, family structures can act in incredibly different ways that shape their survival, that shape their evolution, and that shape the richness of life on Earth. So it really ends up getting you to some originally fringe issues that become increasingly hard to ignore as being central to conservation.
Right. And there's a woman who I've worked with in the past, Philippa Brake. She lives in New Zealand, and she's been working on cetacean culture and how poor conservation methods destroy cultures. And that's another thing that, might be obvious to a lot of us and people in your audience. But basically, one of the major problems, and I've been doing this for a really long time, is people who try to manage or control or whatever manipulative word, manipulate wild population of animals, do not have the background in the nitty-gritty behavior of these animals, the variability, the flexibility, different personalities respond in different ways. And I'm just going to make a comment because I think it's a really important one. People who play the anthropomorphism card do it because it generally, they feel it gives them leverage to harm other animals because we're being, quote, anthropomorphic. But that's just out the window for me. I mean, let's just face it, with all the research in animal emotions and animal sentience, you're not being anthropomorphic if you think that a coyote or a wolf or an elk or a bird or a fish or a reptile, amphibian or insect have feelings, and you can call them whatever you want, but there's also no reason not to use the phrases or words with which we're familiar. And people think that's anthropocentric, but well, I don't think it is, number one. But most people working with animals and managing them and controlling them are anthropocentric. Let's just face it, okay? There's not that many successes on the ground where you really take into account sentience, agency, and personalities.
Great. Thank you both. I'll ask at least one more question, and then we may just go ahead and open it up to the audience because we have a bunch of questions coming in already, and we want to leave as much time as possible for that broader discussion. So this is a question that I imagine might be on some people's minds. I think many people are going to be sympathetic to the idea that, of course, non-human animals have individuality, personality, agency. And yes, we have neglected that, understated its importance in research and policy. And I think that basic message, a lot of people, at least tuning into this talk, are going to be on board. But then when it comes to conservation policy, for example, or broader policies that interact with wild animals and their habitats, maybe people would start to have questions about practicality, about what it would look like to have policies that affect like forests and oceans and somehow account for the personalities and individuality of particular animals. I mean, Matthew, for example, you mentioned a case involving being sensitive to bears' personalities, and you can imagine particular managers doing that with particular animals, especially charismatic megafauna, individual bears, for example. But of course, there are a lot of animals, and not all of them are going to be as recognizable and memorable as perhaps these bears. So, what do you think it would look like, sort of at scale, to take into account the individuality and personality of wild animals when making policies about conservation, and where are the limits there, and how do you bring practicality back into the conversation?
Go ahead, you go first, Matthew. I'm making some notes on that.
Yeah, again, like I'm not really in this applied space. I don't necessarily feel as entitled to, say, here's how you shape a better outcome for your particular conservation program. What we're really presenting here, I feel like, is a menu, and by picking off of that menu, one or a combination of things, you're much more likely to be able to think creatively about vastly different problems in conservation. But I will go back to this idea of animal agency expanding what it is that we're seeking to conserve, right? Which is the way that, in my position more as a scientist than an applied manager, there's a lot of science out there where conservation is increasingly getting reduced to the level of the genome and the level of the species. For instance, in 2016, there was a paper finding that East African giraffes are actually 4 different species because they actually have different enough genomes to justify the designation of speciation for 4 different groups with slightly more different morphologies and mating preference. But we already know that they had different affinities for each other. We already know that they mate with one another differently, that they weren't likely to intermingle, and that they had different behaviors, right? So if we were to kind of take on agency at an earlier part, maybe we wouldn't necessarily need to be so reliant on the level of the genome to decide what species conservation even needs to consist of. If culture and feeding and life cycle and seasonal patterns of migration were as elevated in the conservation agenda.
Yeah. Can I say something on that?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, there's a real life situation happening right now in Colorado. So last December, a year ago, give or take, 10 wolves were reintroduced into Colorado. They were taken from Oregon, dumped on the West Slope, and I call it the dump and pray method. You put them out and you pray, if you pray, and hope that they will survive. So in late spring, it just turned out that a female and a male formed a couple. They had 5 children, and wolves are predators. And even people at CPW would know that. So what did they do? The only pack that formed den near places where there were livestock. I hate the word, but they den near where there were cows and sheep. And guess what? It was like room service. They ate the cows and sheep. And the reason I'm going into the details because I think it obtains to what Matthew and others have been thinking about. So if they listen to the science, and this is a big thing, I'm a scientist and I do a lot on, I've been doing this for decades on science and advocacy for animals. If they had listened to the science, it was well known that removing a leader of a wolf group could lead to its dissolution. So I was very overt and said, let him be. The rancher in question wasn't doing a heck of a lot to protect his livestock, and they were getting paid when, a cow or a sheep was killed. That's what wolves do. First issue, wolves are carnivores, highly evolved, highly social, pack-living animals. CPW went in, trapped the family, the male who had an injured rear leg, died 4 days after being trapped, and it's still an open story as to why he died. The rest, the young, the children, and the mom are somewhere in Colorado in captivity. I honestly don't know where they are. And they missed another youngster who's out there on their own, okay? So this is what happened. Had they listened to the science, it would have been hands off. I worked with them closely, but they stopped asking me what I thought and other people. So I think what's really important here, and I think it pertains to a lot of Matthew's work on agency and just some of the comments you made, is they went in, they demolished a pack, first cohesive pack in 85 or 90 years, and now they want to bring more wolves in. So I'm pushing, I'm not alone. I want wolves in Colorado, and I want live wolves. I don't want corpses. I don't want animals who are released, and then are going to be trapped and put in cages. We should have left them out where they were in Oregon, and the new wolves who are supposed to come in sometime in November, probably in December, are going to come in from British Columbia. Well, they're happy to send the wolves here because it's a wolf killing contest up in British Columbia. So this, I think, is a perfect current on the ground situation with a charismatic carnivore. Okay, we're not talking, although I would apply the same principles to fishes and amphibians. So I think there's a really big problem here in terms of using the science, using agency, and taking the animal's perspective. And of all the papers I wrote, the ones that have gotten most responses from people on the West Slope of Colorado who don't agree with me, focused on the emotional lives and the point of view of the wolves. And that's so tied into individuality and agency. So that's why I found Matthew's papers to be so valuable. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you both. I'll say that we had planned for me to ask you a few more questions. We have so many questions coming
Yeah.
in from the audience that
Here.
I think we should go ahead and open it up, and then we might sprinkle in some of our own questions along the way. But I'm going to hand it over to Becca at this point to start presenting some audience questions, and then may or may not pipe up every now and then. Becca, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you so much, Mark and Matthew. This has been fascinating. Completely reflected in all of these questions that we're getting here from our large audience. I think the audience doesn't actually get to see everyone else who's in this webinar, but we have over 100 people attending today. So it's a great crowd, clearly signaling a lot of interest in this area. So I think this is, reflective of the fact that there is so much engagement here and such, a large audience. That one of the things that we haven't heard so much about from either of you is, and this is the first question that we have from Javier Gonzalez, and I'm just going to expand it out a little bit of just like what sort of pushback, because this represents a real break from a previous sort of mechanistic automaton, way of thinking about animals and conservation that was, very central to our thinking scientifically, but also maybe in conservation practice as well. So there's this major shift. And so in your peer review process or in practical conversations, what kind of important challenges or pushback have you gotten? And I'll invite either of you to respond to that.
I'm also just going to say real quick, since I see a couple of hands up in the participants list, that as a reminder, the audience questions and comments will all be added to the Q&A tab. So we are not going to directly call on people. The webinar is too large for that. So please, if you have anything to contribute, add it to the Q&A tab. Thank you. And sorry, go ahead, Mark and Matthew.
Well, I could speak to the pushback. In the first early papers about compassionate conservation, I had one with Daniel Ramp, who's in Australia, and the journal, I'm not going to mention the journal, got 8 reviews of it, not just 4. In our first 2 papers on compassionate conservation and the importance of compassion in conservation, they both appeared in Conservation Biology, and we were run through the mill. And I'll just be honest, and it's something that, if you will, the younger people might be interested in. So we finally got a review. It was an open review, email with all the editors on it. And I got so upset. I just wrote back and I said, I've had it. I said, they're not going to publish our paper and I'm not going to have my name on it when it's watered down. And seriously, within an hour, the paper was accepted. It was a really good paper. And I don't mean it because I was on the paper, but that really opened the door because everybody on the email list wrote me back and said, did you realize the editors were on that email? I did not. I actually did not. It's a good lesson of how science is done. I didn't realize that, but I did. I said, I've had it. They're pushing us. They want their views. That opened the door. The other pushback came from people who never read some of these papers, saying compassionate conservation was too soft. And the one that I loved was it's too feminine. I actually have some emails and I wrote an article about this. It was too feminine. So my response to these people was thank you. I mean, they were expecting a 45-page philosophical monograph on this. And I said, thank you. But I'm sharing that because especially the younger people, graduate students, undergrads, even high school students, you need to know that these issues we're talking about, they're less contentious than they were. And I hope that Matthew and I and other people maybe in your gallery are contributing to make them more mainstream. But there's a lot of old school people out there who think that humans have the right to do anything they want when they step into the lives of wild animals. So.
Well, that's so great, Mark. And all that I'll say, and presuming that some of this extended to your paper with Arian Wallach.
Yeah, it is that one.
Yeah. So you just loosened the jar for us to pop it open. Like we went to the same, we published it in the same journal. The reviewer feedback, the editors handled it fantastically. A lot of the reviewer feedback, it was not pushing across against any core concepts. Most of what they were saying is what here is new, because our paper was about bringing in multiple threads that already existed, right? So they were like, what here is new? And are you saying you created this facet of it, that facet of it? And we could just really articulate, no, we're not saying that, we invented compassionate conversation. Look at the 2020 paper. No, we're not saying that all of this is brand new, because much of it was being incorporated in indigenous conservation techniques and human wildlife interaction. But what we could say is that in no place did we see all 5 of these principles come together. And as the type of compendium that we found and were able to create of why 190 different conservation programs seem to fail.
Your paper is classic for doing that. I mean, I really mean it. I'm not just saying that because you're here. Well, you're not. You're in New York. But no, your paper is classic about doing that. And I'm glad that Arian Wallach, me, and other people, that our paper opened the door to it, because it was, I mean, somebody said you should write a book about this. And I said, it's a waste of time. Once the paper was published and compassionate conservation and agency and sentience were on the scope of people in the field, and conservation biology is a darn good journal, that's all we wanted to do. But your paper is a beautiful synthesis of all these things that no one's put together. So congratulations. It's really that important.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, great. Just sort of riffing off of that, I wonder how much, how much you think the threat that people were responding to is that, once you start recognizing the individuality, the inherent value, the agency, the personality of animals, you're sort of chipping away at the list of things that we think of as being, exceptional to humans. And even just like the fact that, in your paper, Matthew, you have this idea that somehow animals wouldn't live in cohabitating with, they would want to separate themselves from us. It seems like to some extent, a sort of a core driver for all of this is human exceptionalism. And so I'd love to hear if you both agree with that or disagree with that. And if the extent you do agree with it, like what is the antidote besides just explaining to people against human exceptionalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some people responded to us by being too soft, if you will. Ignoring the science, which was just the most absurd thing ever, because some of the people who were actually criticizing us never studied wild animals. I mean, they got degrees in wildlife management, they read case studies, and they found it very threatening to see people actually writing about compassion, sentience, personalities, emotions. So one of the things I started doing, and it actually worked really well a couple of months ago with the wolves, is I just bring it home and say, would you do it to your dog? So I spent a lot of time in Australia, for example, going back and forth. And we were sitting at a dinner and some guy was just ranting on and on about compassionate conservation is going to kill animals, it's going to harm animals. We don't really know that animals have feelings, blah, 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 blah. And we were talking about mammals, say. And I said, oh, do you have a dog? Uh-huh. And it got quiet. I said, would you just kill your dog? Oh, no. Well, why not? Well, my dog has feelings. So and we were talking about dingoes and kangaroos, all mammals. So I just decided I'm not going to, fight. And then this guy said something that it blew my mind. He said, I love these animals. And I said, well, I'm glad you don't love me. Because what he was saying was basically, he loves these animals, but he was really willing to kill them. I mean, let's cut through the chase. They talk about lethal control. They use all these words that sort of make it more vanilla. They're killing sentient beings. And in the United States, everybody knows about Wildlife Services, for example, that uses horrific methods. So anyway.
Yeah. That seems like that's a powerful way, hopefully, to cut through if it didn't work in the moment. Maybe it's something he'll reflect on afterwards.
Maybe.
Matthew, did you have anything you wanted to add on that note?
Yeah, just a bit that, you know, some of the pushback that we did get was, again, around this idea of anthropomorphism, and that, you know, a great successor to both Marc's and my papers was Christy Ferraro's 2023 or 4 article on revisiting 2 dogmas of conservation science that we shouldn't anthropomorphize. And she was actually able to flesh out multiple examples where projecting human emotions onto different species that were trying to be conserved in terms of what they were looking for and how they differentiated themselves was actually able to improve that conservation outcome. So that's a new frontier on which the dogma, the old guard, is slowly being kind of pushed back against, and we're replacing it with new ways to think about animals as we're trying to conserve them.
And Michael Manfredo, who's at Colorado State University, wrote a beautiful paper showing that anthropomorphism really favored and helped conservation. I mean, I'm cutting through a lot of the chase, but right. I'm glad Matthew brought that up. You know, it's just been an old thing. When I started working with Dale years ago, that was it. Oh, you're being anthropomorphic. And I wrote a paper about what I call the as if disclaimer. They're only behaving as if they feel joy or grief or happiness. I was recently asked to review a paper that basically, cutting through the chase, was whether dogs really enjoy playing. And so I said, no, I'm not going to do it. It's a waste of my time. So my advice, when the person said, and philosophically, it might have been a good paper, but, you know, I'm not a philosopher and I know dogs like to play. He said, well, what can I do to learn about dogs playing and whether they enjoy it? And I said, just go to a dog park. I mean,
Yeah,
times
hopefully.
you don't have a lot of time to waste. So go to a dog park. And if you think they're not enjoying playing, fine, whatever. But don't leave me out of this.
Great. Okay, great. So now we have a question from audience member Jennifer Jacquet on self-interest. So she writes, non-humans have feelings, beliefs, desires, and goals, as Marc said, but Matthew has used the term several times that I find less likely to apply to humans or non-humans, which is acting in their self-interest. Marc, this seems to be a term you avoid. Thoughts on self-interest?
Well, it's funny because I just was writing something for a book. Depends, you know, once again, I'm not a philosopher. And so self-interest would be taking care of yourself, keeping yourself alive, blah, 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 blah. Well, so, and this is half-baked, but I love throwing this out. Just look across diverse species. They've all evolved anti-predatory strategies. I mean, so do they have an interest in living? Yeah, I think they have an interest in living. Look at parental behaviors, maternal, paternal, alloparental, aunts and uncles. Species across the biodiversity of parental care is huge. They have a self-interest. They would like to stay alive and they want their children to stay alive. So it's funny that, and thank you for this question, whoever asked it, because yeah, I mean, I'm sure philosophers can beat this to death. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but of course they have self-interest. Across species, you see threat and appeasement signals to preclude an actual fight that could be injurious. That would be self-interest. Assessments of size, assessments of weight. A lot of birds and other animals have markers of dominance. You know, I'm this color, I'm this big, I'm dominant, don't mess with me. So I'm glad I just made a note because I started writing this in response to somebody writing to me and said, well, we don't really know that individuals care they care to be alive. And I'm thinking, I mean, that's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my life. You don't even have to be, quote, anthropomorphic. You can just look at the evolution of different life-preserving self-interest strategies.
Great.
Marc, this is bringing up some interesting questions for me that I tend to circle back around to about our selected species and how the vast majority of juveniles just die almost immediately. that we could get into if we really wanted to. And again, kind of more philosophically about, you know, might not all species evolve to be K-selected. But I think that's a can of worms that's a little bit outside of the scope of this conversation. For right now, I'll just say, well, hi, Jennifer. Thanks for coming and for your question. There seems to be an implication here also about self-interest being a little bit individualistic. And I would actually potentially take back the term self-interest, but rather talk about interests. And those interests could be individual, they could be societal. And something that I liked about the direction our paper started heading when we all got it together was a certain agnosticism about what those interests are. Because there might, even if we can, you know, more accurately describe animal emotions, there always might be some impenetrability about their inner lives. And I think as long as we can act with that humility, then we could project a number of interests on them and still realizing that they're kind of shaping these conservation outcomes collaboratively.
Great.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well said. Yep.
Okay, so this next question is one that is has a bunch of upvotes and is close to my own heart, from Emily Tronetti. What are some of the ways that we, as members of multi-species communities, can apply this work in our day-to-day life? So I'm adding this, but like we've talked a bit about sort of like how it can change science, how it can change policy, how it can change practice. But how is this, you know, just in our day-to-day lives, like walking down the street, moving through our daily lives and encountering wild animals as individuals with agency, et cetera, et cetera?
I mean, I would, you know, I would just say take in the animals and the plants. You know, there's plants might have feelings too, but I really mean that. Just take in the beauty. You know, I always refer back to Rachel Carson's book, you know, Silent Spring. Do it before you lose it, because a lot of times we miss it when it's gone, and we don't even know. And I actually wrote a book called Rewilding Our Hearts that really speaks to your question. You know, the people say, relax, smell the roses, whatever you want to call it, but take in the beauty, whatever you find beautiful. If you like insects, fine. You like mammals, birds, fish, whoever you really feel, but take it in. And on the other hand, I really believe that if we don't take it in, future generations won't have that panoply of animals and plants, habitats. You know, appreciate a habitat. You know, and one of the things that's really happened a lot, I mean, I used to go to meetings on environmental studies and the environment, and I would be, maybe in a few other people, say, oh, by the way, animals are part of the environment, because there would be not one single paper on animals, you know, ecological integrity. Well, ecosystems will lose their integrity without their animals, especially maybe invertebrates. But I really do mean that. Just stop and take it in. It may be more difficult to do in some places than others, but I've never been anywhere. I mean, really in the middle of Beijing, which is just, you know, a horrifically polluted, highly populated city, where you can't just appreciate something going on. So,
Yeah.
and cherish it and do something about maintaining it.
Yeah. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to second everything that Marc said, right? Notice what is worth protecting. And then I think there are also some major steps that we can do to protect, right? Now, while it isn't always the case that animals prefer incredibly pristine natural habitat, there are major macro scale threats and encroachments onto their habitat. The biggest one of which is animal agriculture. So, you know, when you notice, try to, you know, think about what type of habitat that animal used to have. And, you know, if it's wolf and lynx reintroduction, it's the competition with sheep and cattle ranges that is, you know, the predominant kind of threat and conflict to the existence of these animals. Like, we don't need to be raising cows and corn and soy for pigs and chickens on every square inch that we have left. Similarly, not as many of us are as close to farmland as we are to our urban and suburban environments. And notice your urban and suburban environment as well, how much space the parking lots and the highway interchanges are taking up. Try to talk about densification and public transit as ways to preserve more of that space when we don't need all of the greenfield development and the long 18-lane highways to get us from place to place. We could be living better lives and higher quality lives in greater proximity and access to nature.
Yeah.
And wildlife crossings, once again, we talk a lot about that out here. And when I ride my bike a lot, and I really mean this, we've seen, goats and sheep and other animals playing king or queen of the mountain or the haystack. And people are astounded. They'll say, "Oh, I've read about that. I didn't know they really do that." So I know a lot of the cyclists I ride with get tired of listening to me give sort of little lectures on animal behavior, but I really do mean that. We have prairie dogs here who are slaughtered, and you find corpses all over the road. They're family-loving rodents. They're a keystone species. So I think that one way to get people to appreciate it, and I know a lot of academics don't want to do it, and I certainly was criticized earlier on, write for the public in intelligible terms. I really mean that. Write for the public. Get it out there. That's where the difference is going to be made. Yes, academics make a difference, and I don't mean that in any negative or disparaging way, but write for the public. And among a lot of the people who I interact with quite a lot, just talking about their dog, I use dogs as what I call a gateway species, bridging the empathy gap, if you will, but talk about it and write for the public, because that's really where the changes are going to be made. And I think there's a large receptive audience.
Okay,
Great.
can I cut in for 1 second? I just wanted to say for everybody who was interested in this thread of the conversation that you may or may not have seen that in spring 24, our program released a pretty large, long, but accessible policy report about how cities and other local governments can consider wild animal welfare in local policies on land use in the built environment. And it considers a lot of these issues involving transportation systems and connectivity and green spaces and bird-friendly glass, and how to think a little bit more about the welfare and sentience and agency of wild animals. So do check that report out. It was put out by the Wild Animal Welfare Program in the Guarini Center on Environmental Energy and Land Use Policy here at NYU. Okay, with that said, I'll kick it back to
And
Bekoff.
also the group Biophilic Cities. Yeah, I mean, I love your report, by the way. I mean, it's
Oh, thanks, Marc.
really important because so many people live in cities.
Yeah, appreciate that. And our colleague Tony just put a link to the report in the chat, so you can check it out there too. Becca, that was all I wanted to say. Feel free to continue.
Okay, great. So I'm actually gonna jump down to the bottom here from Stephanie Jones, who writes that I'm an endangered species monitor liaison with the USFF in New York for shorebirds and marine mammals. When I document extensive deleterious beach activities, how do I overcome being told from the USF and W that nothing can be done for these animals because they're on private land? Doesn't the federal law override private land? It's so hard that given those authority to protect, it's so hard that those given the authority to protect animals or paid to do a job are not doing it, and those who want to are hit with obstacles from governmental higher ups. I wonder if either of you have any ideas about how to navigate some of the bureaucracy and internal contradictions that exist in our legal landscape.
Elect politicians who are sensitive. No, I mean, really. Well, just say the hell with it and do what you want to do. I really mean that. I think that there's a lot of room here for, if you will, counterculture, different views. I mean, one of the points we made in our early first paper on compassionate conservation was, dealing with invasive species, was that invasive species don't suffer less. Individuals of, and it just seems so obvious. And Arian and I had, Wallach, who's an amazing woman, talked about that, but actually people focused on that a bit. But sometimes, I don't know if it's my generation. Sometimes you just got to go out and do what you really feel is right. You just have to do it, or else they're going to play political games and all that. Animals on private land don't suffer more or less than animals on the other side of the fence. And that's why once again, I think making the concepts of agency and sentience and personality palatable to lay people, if you will, is really critical, and they can use that.
In your experience in Colorado, were you, or anywhere else, were you able to find anyone within government organizations or representatives who really saw things, really supported this perspective, so you can sort of build allyships? Or were you sort of finding again and again that they're just taking a much more sort of like species level perspective on everything?
Well, the current administration of Governor Jared Polis and his husband Marlon Reese, I work very closely with both of them, is very user friendly.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you asked that. But Jared only has 2 more years. And even if a new governor comes in and says, I love animals, I mean, we know about people who say I love animals and they kill them. I'm not saying that the new governor will do that, but it's a great question. Excuse me, you're asking, Becca, because yes, I mean, but we're not making the progress we thought we would. Not because of the governor and his husband, mainly because of the resistance. We tried to get rid of puppy mills, and it failed by a very close vote because people were afraid that their friends' pet stores would go out of business. I mean, I'm just being dead honest about it. And that's why we're working really hard now. And we are, on the ground trying to get some policies into, I don't know what you call them because I'm not a lawyer, but bills to laws.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
It's a really good question. And also right to your, the politicians, whatever, representatives and senators. Yeah, you'll learn that a lot of them aren't public servants, although they claim to be. But you never know when you're going to tap into somebody who goes, "Oh, wow, I hadn't thought about that." Or, "Wow, I'm glad you're interested." And that's what we've been doing for the last 6 years in Colorado.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add, there's always, I'm a little confused by the question because I'm not actually sure what statutory authority US Fish and Wildlife have on private land. And whether this, in particular, whether these are endangered species and what the kind of discretion of enforcement is there. But if there is, a law and statutory authority that is not being enforced, then the main mechanism for that is always litigation, right? So it's one example of a wider occurrence that I think we're going to see as the federal government in the next administration, as many predict, are going to sleep on their statutory authority and their enforcement discretion, that we get more and more creative about how we apply litigation and other novel forms of kind of community pressure to get that Marc was describing, to get action on some of these areas. I think without that, we're going to just feel incredibly defeated. And that creativity and nimbleness, dexterity, are going to become more important in the next 4 years than they even have been already.
And I really never say never. Just you got to keep at it. It's exhausting, but yeah. And once again, talking about animals as individuals, a rabbit on private land doesn't suffer less than a wild rabbit. I'm fine. I honestly was thinking, because I was telling the governor and Marlon and this group we meet with, that the things that I've written about the wolves that have gotten the most traction, even among anti-wolf people, have been talking about the emotional lives, the sentience. I didn't use the word agency, but that they want more freedom of choice and to express their individuality. I was actually surprised how many people wrote to me. Nice letters.
Yeah.
Some of the ones I get are just vulgar, but yeah.
Okay, great. So now I'm jumping to a question from Alex Putzer. I think there might be a typo here, so I apologize if I'm misinterpreting what the question is. But they write, thank you for these contributions. And then there's, I think, how I'm understanding this, they write some that policies that where you end up partially domesticating wild animals. And I think the idea here is that we sort of coordinate with the animals or teach them how to behave around human beings so that there's a conflict reduction. And that, like, you know, we're sort of like pulling them more into our space through our engagement with them. And so if I've understood this question correctly, I think it's a really interesting one. And it gets back to sort of, I think, what Matthew was saying about sort of like co-creation and collaboration with wild animals. And do you think there's any tension there with like just sort of like domesticating them or like removing some sort of like inherent wonder from them because they become sort of like more humanized or something like that?
I'll just say one thing: we're not domesticating; we're socializing them.
Great.
Domestication is a long term. But Matthew, this is more your area.
This is a sticky trade-off that is not, I think, you know, it's going to be really specific for any individual. I mean, generally conservation programs are responding to a threat. And I do think that we need to think about, you know, socialization as another kind of existential threat. But often we're in the situation now where existential threats just need to be weighed against one another. I mean, look at wildlife conservation in New Zealand. I know, Marc, you have a very kind of, you know, anti, you know, killing kind of approach. And at the same time, you know, there's just massive wildlife declines from animals that are not habituated, you know. So often in conservation, we're weighing one existential threat against one another. All that I'll say is that I think this gives us more of a strategy to acknowledge that, you know, what the full scope of competing interests are, which is that if you are retraining a group of animals that is, say, you know, acculturating itself to agricultural areas to prefer, I don't know, some sacrifice zone that you have or some feeding center for bears that you have set up or whatever else, then you might not be deleting genetic diversity, but you might be deleting some cultural diversity and some behavioral diversity as well. And so, you know, I think without kind of an agency, a sociality, a culture approach, you might end up putting the cart before the horse a little too early, or whatever metaphor applies here.
Yeah, that's a great response, Matthew. That's really helpful. Thank you. Um, I'll actually ask a question I had for you, Marc, based on sort of something you mentioned all the way at the beginning about personality. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit more about that because you mentioned it briefly, but we haven't really lingered on it. But this idea that we originally, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting what you said, but this is just consider this an invitation to talk more about your ideas at the beginning. But we originally had this sort of like mechanistic, deterministic view of animals as all behaving exactly rigidly the same way. And now it feels like the pendulum has swung away from that, but like almost making the same category error of saying like, now we're saying mechanistically, rigidly, you're all behaving exactly according to your personality, rather than understanding that, you know, it's somewhere in between, that animals are making choices and, you know, responding flexibly and adaptively. It's not like the idea that that means they don't have a personality. It's just that, you know, it's also not mechanistic and rigid and deterministic. Anyway, that was what I was sort of thinking about when you
Yeah.
were talking about that at the beginning. And if we could hear some more from you about those ideas, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, so hardwired behaviors are often parental behaviors, anti-predatory behaviors, maybe responses to threat, you know, in physical interactions. So it's an interplay of hardwired, more genetically maybe determined behavior patterns mixed in with learning and flexibility. So individuals will respond, you know, in a wolf pack or a group of animals, it could be fishes, it could be birds, it could be amphibians, you know, they're going to learn. They're not saying, oh, Joe over there and Mary over there have bold personalities because they don't care. They're going to say in this, and it's a probability thing. And I actually wrote a paper with a mathematician about this, about birds. They're weighing a probability, like Becca will do this, Joe will do this, Matthew will do this, Marc will do this. And they're weighing that, but there are hardwired behaviors, you know, and we know that. And the reason your question is so interesting is because I'm an ethologist, and when I was in grad school, we read a lot of the work of Konrad Lorenz, Nico Tinbergen, and Carl von Frisch, three of whom won the Nobel Prize in behavior and physiology, much to the dismay of, quote, real scientists, because beat the hell out of Lorenz, von Frisch, and Tinbergen. But your question's a really important one, because even Lorenz felt that inborn behaviors could be modified. And there's a wonderful paper by a guy named Jack Haleman. It's available online. It's called the modification of an instinct, basically. He was looking at pecking in herring gulls and showed that it actually is modifiable. The reason I mention that is that there's just a lot of behavior patterns that are hardwired, but they can be modified, okay? But if you go back and look at the early literature too, a lot of the classical ethologists were talking around concepts like agency, sentience, and, say, personality. And Nico Tinbergen, Dale and I wrote a paper about applying his work to Donald Griffin's work. He never said, and because he's misquoted a lot, that animals don't have emotions. He basically said we can't study them, which is a huge differentiation. So I like I love that question, because just when I look at the wolves in Colorado now, or the coyotes I studied, you'd see them do things, or especially the coyotes, you go, God, that's kind of maladaptive, but there are behavior patterns over which they have some control, but not a lot of control because they're hardwired. So it's a blend. And Donald Griffin's early work on subjective experiences and consciousness should be required reading for anybody studying animal behavior.
Great. Well, on that note, I will wrap it up here. So thank you both so much. This was an incredible exploration and reflection on these very new and important issues. Thank you to our audience and all for your fantastic questions. I'm sorry that we did not get a chance to go through them all. And I'd also like to give a special thanks to Tony Sims for help behind the scenes with setting this up, and Sophia Fogel-Davis for helping us with administration and organization. None of this would have happened without you two. So thank you so much. And yeah, that's it for today. And thank you all. And we'll see you next time.